Okay, let's get started. Thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited about our Digital Scholar webinar today. This is hosted by the Southern California Clinical and Translational Science Institute at the University of Southern California and Children's Hospital, LA. So my name is Eric Peterson. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at USC. I'm also the co-director of digital recruitment and scholarship. We ask today that you put questions that you have either into the chat or into the Q&A function in Zoom. Our speaker today has prepared a very interactive discussion. So he will take questions as they come up, but also I will facilitate a discussion at the end here. So as questions come up, type them in the chat. I'll compile them and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So today we're very excited to welcome Andy Langdon. He's going to be talking about effectively utilizing video in research. And so Andy Langdon is the founder and creative director of Good Pictures. He has a bachelor's degree in film and television production from Loyola Marymount University, which is out here in Los Angeles. He has more than 8 years of experience in the digital media space and is an award-winning creative director, video producer, and nonprofit consultant. He's worked with the NFL, he's worked with USC, he's worked with the RAND Corporation, all kinds of organizations, and done some really beautiful work. So he's excited to share some of his work with you today. His work has been trusted and sponsored by many institutions and companies. And I should mention that Andy is a very good friend, and I'm very excited that he decided to do this today. He has shot some videos for some of our research, and I think he's going to share some of those today. So I'd like to introduce Andy Langdon.
So today we'll be talking about effectively utilizing video in your research. We're going to be covering high-level strategies and considerations. This is not a DIY about how to set up a camera, how to set up lighting equipment, grip equipment, or sound equipment. We'll stay away from anything too technical in that realm and just focus on everything that is high level and hopefully applicable to your work. Now, there's a chance that no one here has had significant experience with utilizing video in their work. And of course, that's all right. But if you have utilized video in the past, what is one unexpected challenge that you've run into? So think about it and feel free to enter into the chat one unexpected challenge you've run into. Now, if no one has any experience with video, again, that's all right. Eric, feel free to chime in and comment on your experience with Brave. Leah said, audio is sometimes off when playing videos at conferences. Absolutely, there's playback of the video and audio and having the audio be out of sync. Eric's comment was trying to do it yourself with limited skills or equipment or both. Absolutely. Leah clarified and said, not necessarily off, but too low for audiences to hear details. Actually, Leah, I'm really glad you mentioned that because we are going to be covering what I'm generally referring to as accessibility today. And accessibility is going to be geared towards making sure that your intended message actually connects with your intended audience and kind of strategies to make sure that's the case. Steve says, didn't realize the amount of work involved in even a short video. That's also a really good point. A lot of times I'll work with people, I'll collaborate with people who don't have prior experience with video. And of course, that's okay. But a common misconception is that shorter is easier or simpler. In fact, the duration of the video does have quite a bit of impact on the amount of work involved, but it is not a determinant factor in how simple or complex the video is. All right. So feel free to comment, anything else if you think of it, but we're going to go ahead and move on for now. Hopefully we can answer some questions that you're thinking about or challenges that you've run into in the past. So our first learning objective of a few is going to be about calls to action. A call to action can take many forms, but it's simply outlining the next step a viewer can take after viewing a video, which is very important and often forgotten about with someone who's engaging with video for the first time. The second learning objective here is we will walk through different video formats, allowing you ultimately to select which video format might be most suitable for your objectives. And by different video formats, I'm referring to high-level approaches that generally outline an effective plan for moving forward. And we'll get into more of that later. And the third and final learning objective for today is we will be covering accessibility, going back to Leah's comment, in tandem with diversity and inclusion, which will include the very practical side of making sure your content is actually connecting with your intended audience in the intended ways. So we'll get into that a bit later. So before we dive in, here's a roadmap of the topics we'll be covering today. We'll start by talking about simplifying and focusing your story. We'll move on to reverse engineering your process, and then selecting a suitable audiovisual approach, and then prioritizing accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. And finally, ultimately producing a polished and engaging video. Let's start with simplifying your story. Well, I don't even pretend to understand everything that goes into your research. I get that it's complex and there's a lot at play. For the sake of preserving your sanity and, equally importantly, actually connecting with your intended audience, just go ahead and start by simplifying. There are so many things you can tell someone about your research, but what is actually the most important thing to communicate? Sometimes it's important to remember what you don't tell someone is just as important as what you do tell someone when it comes to video production. Also remember this, even if you live with your research day in and day out, your research might be brand new to your audience, meaning it's the first time they've ever thought about a particular subject or idea, or at least in this way that you're presenting it. So be sure to give them a chance to absorb what you're telling them. So to highlight one example of simplifying your story, here's an example of a public service announcement that we created and produced for an anti-sexual violence nonprofit. Now, as a courtesy heads up, I do want to mention before playing this video that there is discussion of sexual trauma. However, nothing is discussed in explicit detail. That said, if you'd like to mute and rejoin us in 2 minutes and 30 seconds, please feel free to do so. I'm going to go ahead and play the video.
I was sexually abused when I was about 8 by an older male cousin.
I've been sexually assaulted on 4 different occasions.
I was 6 years old, the first time that I was molested. A neighbor named Hank took me into his house. And at first it was hugging, and then his hands traveled. And when I tried to push him away, he beat me. And then he raped me.
And I was haunted by the fact that this happened in a little girl's bedroom. For a long time, I blamed myself. I was just angry because I'd go to school and nobody in school knew what was going on.
When I tried to tell my mom, she kicked me out of the house and laughed at me and told me I would never deserve anything better.
It became something that lasted until I was 17 years old.
I remember after it happened and after he left, sitting on a bed for a while, torn up and saying, I am never going to tell another living person about this. I went and got my friends and I drove them home.
Thank you for reading that, Katrina.
Thanks.
Now, if you had the chance, how would you respond to this person's story?
I just feel like, or just like hug her, and just let her know it's not her fault.
You were a little girl. It's not your fault, honey.
You actually have the chance to meet that person because they're here today. This is James Metters. This is Mark Godoy Jr. This is Isaac Andrade. This is Walter Castaneda. This is Glenn Hall. He served in the Army for 30 years, retiring as Command Sergeant Major. And what you just read is his story. What you just read was his story.
Oh my God.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you for reading my story. know the statistic.
So we're going to stop there. So the thing that I want to mention about that video, which still makes me a little emotional every time I watch it, that video is only communicating one single idea, that anyone, including boys and men, can be survivors of sexual trauma. And in fact, tens of millions of boys and men in the United States are survivors. So this PSA was created and produced for the nonprofit 1 in 6, which specifically works with boys and men who have experienced who have had unwanted or abusive sexual experiences. And the results of this public service announcement, which was funded by the NFL in part, were pretty exciting. Upworthy published the piece, and it has been viewed over 5 million times to date, and it won a Telly Award. The US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission also uses the piece as part of their training for all staff, and it continues to raise awareness about the issue. To me, it's a testament to the power of keeping a message honest, simple, and focused. It's important to note that if you confuse or overwhelm your audience logically, it's highly unlikely that you will be able to connect with your audience emotionally, which can be quite important, especially when you're working with a challenging or sensitive subject matter. So let's move into the second part of this discussion, of this presentation, which is about reverse engineering your process. So now that you figured out a very general and rough idea of the story that you want to focus a video on, using the 1 in 6 public service announcement as an example, let's say you have a rough idea of the video or a series of videos, depending on what you need to accomplish, then what? So the easiest place is to start from your intended outcomes and real world constraints, and then work backward from there. So don't let the process overwhelm you. Simplify your story and then just work backwards. Pardon me. So ask yourself some key questions to start. What is my primary objective here? For example, and again, I don't know everything about your world, but one possibility is recruiting volunteers for a study. Or is your objective to encourage someone to change an unhealthy or destructive behavior? Who is my primary audience? Try to be as specific as possible here. Your audience will determine various things about your specific approach, which we'll discuss more soon. But think about how differently you might communicate with a colleague in your research field compared to a good friend who works as a restaurant manager, let's say. You use very different language for each person. No need to land on an exact length at this stage in the game, but generally speaking, will it take 60 seconds or will it take 60 minutes to tell your story? And how should the story of the video generally resonate with viewers? Should it connect with them in an emotionally honest way, like the 1 in 6 public service announcement? Or should it be a presentation of clear-cut facts? If what you really need to communicate is fact-driven research, and you just need to figure out the clearest way to describe a message to an audience. Or perhaps a hybrid approach between the two. And we'll get into that a little bit more later too. And then finally, when you're reverse engineering, think about where's the video going to live at the end of the day? Is this going to be shown to people in person at a conference? Is it going to live online? If it's going to live online, will it live online on YouTube, on a website? Will it be a part of a series? Will it be a part of an interactive website? All of this will help shape your approach. So another example that we're going to be taking a look at is, this is a single clip from the latest intervention that Eric brought to us. And I'll explain more after watching the clip. But here is a clip from Project Brave.
Look, the fact is, the majority of us vets have a hard time finding purpose and meaning in our lives after the military. Many struggle to find something that satisfies us as much as our service did, or find that it's challenging to reintegrate back into regular work culture and into our families after we serve. We veterans are exceptional at handling stress and adversity in a military environment, but it can be difficult adapting to different stressors out here in civilian life. Some vets have said that they try hard to keep it together on their own, and some recognize that they could benefit from some help, but put it off until something major happens. When stress builds up in the body, it can reach a boiling point and become overwhelming to manage alone. And this can lead to a crisis or have harmful chronic effects on your sleep, your relationships, and your physical health. This is because your mental balance impacts personal and work relationships as well as your physical health. And like a cycle, those in turn impact your mental balance. Sometimes folks need help discovering new tools to deal with new problems. And that's what mental health treatment is, discovering new tools to.
All right, so that video is one of about 20 or so clips, which make up the overall online intervention that Eric brought to us and created. The overall intervention should take approximately 30 minutes, I believe, to complete in total. In addition to the videos, there are interactive elements and audio clips, which guide the users through the intervention. So we had to consider how the video would function with within that interactive experience. If you work backward from your intended outcome, you'll be able to begin to see what your video or series of videos might need to communicate. And to revisit our previous point about simplifying your story, part of what Eric and his team did an exceptional job with was developing a script that takes viewers through the intervention step by step in a way that encourages focus and tries not to overwhelm. Another thing Eric and his team did quite well was striking a balance between being informative and emotionally resonant. Of course, the information needs to be presented accurately and clearly at the end of the day, but it's also extremely important to empathize with your audience, who in this case are veterans. It can be challenging to ask for help, and Eric's script does a nice job meeting veterans where they are, which is incredibly important in being effective in your messaging. All right, let's move on to the next topic, which is selecting a suitable approach. Now you can take the next step towards identifying a more concrete and specific format that might fit your needs. Now, this can take on many different forms, but we'll discuss a few popular formats that might be relevant to your work as researchers. To start, will you need to write a script? Or will you need to capture something more candid, like a case study, in the form of a short documentary, which would be outlined but not scripted? Is it one video or is it a series of videos? Would animation be helpful as a tool to illustrate specific ideas you need to communicate? Two formats I see enormous potential for in the research world are, one, scripted hybrid videos that combine live action, and by live action, I mean a person on camera, with illustration and animation to outline specific concepts that the person on camera is talking about. And the second format is video libraries, which I think in y'all's world you refer to as qualitative research studies, or it can be a part of a qualitative research study or an oral history project, where the video library basically contains clips from interviews with various people discussing different subtopics within an overall topic. We'll discuss this more in a bit in the next section with an example from a video library we created also for 1 in 6 actually, which is the nonprofit serving male survivors of sexual trauma. All right, so here is a trailer for an online course library that will be launching soon. It's not yet live, set to launch, I think in the end of April, beginning of May. And it's similar to Masterclass or LinkedIn Learning, if you're familiar with either of those. So I'll go ahead and play this trailer for an online course library, and then we'll continue after that.
College prepares you for many things. Filling out loan applications, finding the only good party on a Wednesday, figuring out just the right amount of caffeine for an all-night study session, and of course, using your degree to land a job. But college gets an F in teaching students how to succeed once they finally set foot in the office. The fact is, there are specific skills that mean the difference between a job and a career you control. Those skills aren't intuitive. They're never taught on your first day at work, and they take plenty of time and patience to figure out on your own. That's why we created Office Intelligence. Office Intelligence teaches students and professionals the skills they need to succeed in the workplace, regardless of their role or industry. We teach what you were never taught, but need to know, like how to communicate effectively in a Slack-crazed office, how to use criticism to your advantage, how to understand the many types of contracts that will come across your desk, and much more. We split our courses into straightforward sections that you can tackle in minutes, not hours. Want to brush up on your skills? Nervous going into your first big call? Jump back into any course and get the refresher you need fast. Try one of our courses today and start acing your career.
All right. So our approach, as you can see very obviously, was to do a hybrid between live action and animations. This is one of the two formats that I think has enormous potential for the research world. Basically, you script it out, you shoot a person talking in front of camera or people talking in front of camera. So it's similar to what we shot with Brave, and then it's just adding the layer of animations, in this case, for Office Intelligence, to paint a really dynamic, vivid picture of what these courses are ultimately going to be teaching people. And it's just it's a fun, polished, engaging way to make sure that you're communicating all the stuff that you need to communicate through the script, but then also kind of, visually taking people on a journey. Now, the client originally approached me requesting wall-to-wall animation, but I encouraged a hybrid approach for both creative benefit and the sake of our budget. Animation can be time-consuming, especially for longer formats. So the full courses themselves run at about 30 minutes a piece. So 60 minutes total for the first two courses, which we're launching with. And that would have been quite cost prohibitive. But animation does provide a lot of value. Equally importantly as the budget considerations, I think that it's really valuable for an audience to see the person who is teaching them, to establish rapport, build trust, make sure there's a connection there. That said, utilizing a certain amount of animation does give us a great tool for outlining specific concepts, adding humor, which we do in a few different spots, and offering clarity to the viewer. We also thought that animation would resonate well with our primary audience of young, well-educated professionals. Now, I want to point out, at the end of nearly every project we work on, and this was also one of the learning objectives that I outlined at the beginning, we create a clear call to action for the audience. Now, for Office Intelligence, this is verbally spoken. Jeff says, try one of our courses today and start acing your career, since the viewers will already be on the website when they view this video. For other projects, we might create a call to action to visit a website or volunteer to participate in a study or donate to a nonprofit organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about calls to action and end screens in the next section. Now, one of the key principles here is to constantly remind yourself of your primary audience's perspective. This is important in terms of representing diverse voices and advocating for an inclusive and equitable world, but also obsessing over your audience's perspective has very practical effects on their comprehension of your intended message. If you carefully consider your audience's perspective, you're much more likely to craft a message that meets them where they're at and ultimately communicates more effectively. Here's a short list of various intersectional identities and experiences that you might want to consider. Certainly, this isn't a new list to you, but it is incredibly important when approaching a video project because of how multifaceted and dynamic it can be to consider all of these considerations and others. All right, so the real example of accessibility, diversity, and inclusion is the video library itself here. So I'm only, because of our limited time, going to show one video from this video library, but I'll explain how the single video exists as a part of the overall video library that I was mentioning earlier. Pardon me. So this is one clip from a video library that consists of nearly 400 clips of men discussing their experiences related to various topics within the overall issue of male sexual trauma.
Like, man, I was a linebacker playing football, oh man, not only, you know how things are in our society, just like how to be a man. You gotta be tough, you gotta be, and then I'm playing football and you gotta be ultra that all the time. Like I told you, like, I wouldn't cry. Like, I had no emotion. Like, I'm hurt. If I'm hurting all over the place, like, you just learn to just shake it off or like whatever. Like, even since I've been done, like, of course I have some health issues, like, but in my mind, it's nothing. Because I'm like, I can still walk. It's like, I think if I'm really being honest too, it's something that definitely served to keep me from healing too, because we're humans. Like, we're feeling creatures. That's what we are. We can't get around it. You're gonna feel everything. It's gonna happen sometimes. You can't get away from it. Like, sometimes you're gonna feel sad. Sometimes you're gonna want to cry. So you'll see something that's going to make you want to cry, or you're going to see something that's going to make you angry, or you're going to feel sad or whatever. But instead of dealing with it, you run from it, or you just like, oh, that's not me. I'm super tough, blah, blah, blah. But just like I told you earlier, I understand. I'm fully aware of what we are. And I'm not running from it. Like, if something gets me sad, I'll cry. Like 1 in 6. The fact that there's been guys that have lived with this stuff for years, and then the fact that they can't even, I'm sad, but I'm a man, and men don't get sad. Or I'm depressed, but I'm a man. Men don't get depressed. Man, I feel like crying. Men don't cry. Boys don't cry. So you never really get in touch with any of this stuff so you can heal. And that's what's so bad about it. Because you're never moving on. Like, I still would have been the same 5-year-old boy inside if I never dealt with any of my emotions. And that's why it's so scary, because you have full-grown men that are still those little boys that like are still asking, like, is it okay to cry? Is it okay to deal with this? Is it okay to say something bad is happening, like that you're going through something? And it is toxic. It is toxic. It's completely toxic. And the fact of the matter is, it's scary too, because you sit there and think of all these people walking around this way, ticking time bombs, because eventually it's going to get to the point where, hey, just like with me, like accordion, it's going to pop. And then they're going to do something crazy or whatever, and everyone's going to be asking, why'd they do that? Because they never dealt with it. And there's never a place. You never made the environment welcoming enough for them to deal with it.
All right, so at this point, we're gonna stay on this video for a second because there are a few things that I wanna talk about. I'm gonna pause this video. Okay. So, like I said, there are a few things that I wanna walk through here. The first is accessibility. You'll notice at the beginning of the video, I'll go back to the beginning. We have a very simple intro card, a text card that says, Reggie Walker is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Something as simple as this is really important because if, for example, someone were to search through Google or YouTube to find this video, which is the primary way that people would encounter this video because it lives on YouTube, we want that person to have the necessary context to understand what Reggie's comments within this clip generally relate to. We also establish further context in the video title and the video description, but it doesn't hurt to, in video at the beginning with an intro text card, add that additional context for a viewer. Now, if we had the resources, it would have been ideal to manually caption every single one of these 400 videos. Fortunately, though, and this is really helpful for anybody who is interacting with YouTube and using video on YouTube, YouTube has gotten somewhat decent at auto-generating captions. It's not always perfect. You can kind of try it out for yourself. You can use it on random videos, but it's pretty decent, at least as a starting point. So captions are obviously going to make your video more accessible for people who have visual impairments, but also just for people who are engaging with videos. Let's say someone's engaging with a video in a feed-based environment rather than a search-based environment. So feed-based would be Facebook, search-based would be YouTube, and someone's scrolling through videos. If you have captions on that video, you're going to connect with someone in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise connected with that person because the video is muted. So they have no reason to start engaging with your video unless the visuals are just really compelling. Oh, sorry, I did mean audio impairments. Yes, thank you, Gordon. Now, with the end screen, let's go to the end screen at the end of this video. All right. So to me, the end screen is a crucial piece when we're talking about accessibility. Obviously, this looks different depending on whether your videos live on YouTube or if they live on a website. They could be embedded from YouTube on a website. There are many ways to approach this. But with YouTube specifically, this is kind of the way that you can utilize an end screen. Let's say a person randomly finds this interview clip of Reggie Walker. They watch his clip and they really connect with his comments about masculinity. There's an end screen here where after the clip, the user can click to watch more about this topic, which in this case sends them to a playlist of clips of men discussing their experiences around masculinity as it relates to their sexual trauma. Let's say someone else saw the same clip, but they thought, gosh, I really like Reggie's perspective in general on things. I wonder what else he has to say about his experiences. Well, in that case, there's a second playlist where the viewer can click to watch more from this interview, which links to a playlist of more Reggie clips. Because this was for a nonprofit, there's also a link to find direct support through the 1 in 6 website, and there's a link to donate to that nonprofit organization. Now, the whole goal here is this. Once someone has connected with a resource that is useful to them, we obviously want them to be able to further engage with it in the way that is most helpful to them in that moment. So you're basically creating a stream. Once someone finds content that's useful, they can then branch off and find additional content that might also be helpful to them. Now, as for the metadata, and by metadata, I mean the video title, the video description, and the tags that you would input when you're uploading a video to YouTube. Always use relevant keywords. to make this video searchable for anybody seeking help online. And all of this functionality is such a huge part of why YouTube can be such a powerful tool. The videos from this video library have been viewed a total of nearly 5.5 million times so far over the last couple of years, I think. And the videos continue to reach new people every day because they live on YouTube, which is searchable, and YouTube is also searchable through Google. So this slide shows some intersectional identities grouped together intentionally and certain ways that we can prioritize being accessible, diverse, and inclusive. With diversity, we did everything in our power using the 1 in 6 video library as an example. We did everything in our power to add as much diversity to the library as possible. And by diversity, specifically in this case, I mean race, sexuality, age, lived experience, socioeconomic status, and others. Now, I do want to point out that the focus of the nonprofit 1 in 6 is to support male identifying survivors. So we don't feature any interviews with people of other genders here. That's just specific to the focus of that nonprofit. Now let's talk about preferred language. I use language here to mean words, colloquialisms, just kind of the general way that someone might describe their experience. So one of the ways to lean into preferred language is to let interviewees themselves or on-camera talent tell their stories in the way that they choose. So with Reggie's interview, for example, it was virtually unprompted. He's telling us his story in exactly the words that he chooses to tell it. He talks about his experience with masculinity being toxic culturally. Those are all specific to his experience, which, in the case of this video library, I think lends a lot of honesty and authenticity to the perspective here. Another way to lean into preferred language, which Eric did on Brave, was asking veterans themselves, the on-camera talent, to review and edit the script before we shot to make sure we were speaking colloquially and accurately, just as importantly, to veterans' experiences. Another way to lean into preferred language is to consult with people who have lived experiences about which you're communicating. As a general rule, don't overcomplicate your language as much as possible. Consider your audience's level of education and ability, and let that drive the words you choose, whether spoken or written. Consider people who are deaf, blind, or have another disability which might impede their ability to engage with your message. Add captions if possible, use high contrast with text for better visibility, and increase your text size, especially if your videos will be viewed on smaller screens. So that's kind of another realm that we won't get too far into. But one of the things I'm constantly thinking about as a director and producer working in different screen formats is, where's the person going to be watching this video at the end of the day? On a giant Jumbotron at an in-person event? Or are they going to be looking at it on an older iPhone that has a smaller screen? It's really important to consider how big your screen is to make sure that your message is ultimately accessible to your audience. So now finally, ultimately, this is kind of the culmination of what we're talking about. Invest the time and resources needed to communicate your research effectively. This definitely doesn't mean doing everything on your own. In certain cases, maybe it does mean doing everything on your own if you simply don't have the budget to collaborate with other people on producing polished and engaging videos. And the needs of every project will be very different. So no two projects are the same. Some are very small in scope, some are very large in scope. But while I'm sure you wouldn't expect me to conduct rock solid research, I would not expect you to be able to produce a polished and engaging video on your own per se, unless you have past experience. That said, some of you might be very comfortable doing so. But a lot of you might find the list of to-dos on this slide very much outside the scope of the work that you need to focus on day to day. These are some of the component pieces involved in virtually every video production process. They change and expand and contract based on need, but if effectively communicating your research through video can offer significant value, I do encourage you to consider investing in this process and collaborating with a video producer or production agency. People like myself can help you bring research to life in new ways that maybe you've thought about and dreamt of, and maybe you haven't considered yet, but collaborating with someone who's a visual storyteller could benefit your work. So as we start to wind down, here's a public service announcement that we produced for the state of California, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. I'll go ahead and play it and then continue speaking about it afterward.
We are in rare form today, Eugene. Oh, hey. And an extra.
Thank you, sir. Get some rest.
Why not?
Diane. No, this one's going this way. Are you calling me a cheater? Yeah, I'm calling you a cheater. Hey. All right, give it up. Thank you. You come and see me.
What is going on with Eugene?
I got the vaccine.
All right, so, pardon my cough. It is not COVID, it's a cold. I've had 2 negative tests. Okay, so the Department of Corrections was trying to encourage staff all throughout the state of California to get a COVID vaccine. This was back in around April of 2021, I believe. So kind of right around when everybody was ramping up with getting COVID vaccines, vaccine availability was increasing. So the state of California came to me and they wanted to produce something relatively short and impactful. And they wanted something that was produced relatively quickly, obviously, because this was time sensitive. So we pitched and we wrote a comedic script for them. We also wrote a dramatic script for a slightly longer form, still short form, but it was 2.5 minutes, dramatic piece. We basically wanted to maximize, kind of the potential to connect with our intended audience by going the comedic route and also the dramatic route, so that if one didn't connect with the intended audience, perhaps the other would. So we cast actors for each PSA remotely through Zoom, since it was the height of COVID at that time. We scouted and secured 3 different locations, which we made look like 4. We scheduled 2 full shoot days. We rented equipment. We shot both pieces with a cast and crew of around 25 to 30 people. We handled editing, color grading, sound mixing, and final delivery. And kind of all of this just to show when you do invest in a message, so this message obviously being get a COVID vaccine, please. You can find you can produce some really nice, polished, engaging results. The client was really thrilled with this. They were, kind of exceeded, I think, their expectations of communicating this message to their intended audience. But they were thrilled to be able to send it out to all of their staff of getting people to get a vaccine. So whether or not this specific type of video is relevant to your work, I did just want to show you this as an example of what's possible when you do invest properly in your approach to communicating your message through video, and also walk you through the general process without getting too in the weeds. Now we have the same question as before, or piggybacking on it. Does anyone happen to have any ideas now, after what we covered in this presentation, that they'd like to share about one way that you could use video more effectively in your research? and it's okay if nobody has any ideas, but hopefully this offered some inspiration. All right, so we'll go ahead and move forward. Really at the end of the day, this checklist, these 3 bullet points are just kind of starters to get you thinking about the possibilities that are out there. Do you want a scripted video like Project Brave that we produced with Eric? Do you want a scripted video like Office Intelligence with someone talking on screen with animation and illustrations over top? Do you want one video or a series of videos? Do you have so much information that you absolutely do need to communicate that you have to produce 10 videos or 15 or 30 or 400 in the case of a video library? What is the most effective approach to communicating your research, helping people most effectively, really just ultimately connecting with your intended audience? And finally, if anybody wants to chat further or have a follow-up discussion about anything we've covered today, I would love to talk with you. I would love to be helpful in your work if you have any video production needs. But I'm more than happy to have a discussion with anybody who would like it after this. And finally, thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it today. All right, Eric. I'm going to stop.
Great,
sharing.
I'm back. You hear me okay, Andy?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. This was phenomenal. Exactly what I was hoping it would be. I think our digital scholars are going to get a ton out of this. And just so everybody knows, this will be posted up on our website, so you can watch it again, refer back to it. If you have any further questions, also please contact Andy as well. So I've got a few questions for you that came through the chat.
Great.
One was just a pretty specific question. After you showed the video with the animation for the learning platform, what was the animation platform that was used by Good Pictures for that video?
Yeah, so that's After Effects. After Effects of the Adobe, we use After Effects, Illustrator. It says my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me okay?
You're back.
Okay. As creatives, we use After Effects, the animation software that you were asking about. We use Illustrator to illustrate, Photoshop, obviously, all the time, Premiere for video editing, and there are others. But yeah, it's a part of the Adobe Creative Suite, and the software is called After Effects.
Thanks. And then, on that topic, so Andy's been with us through 3 research projects, and as he has learned, and through his nonprofit work, he's usually dealing with people that don't have a ton of money. So research projects, you have money for salaries, for incentives, and then, very little money to do a really good looking product. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And first, and I could just share my experience. So, the work Andy did with us started out with a program where this was the first one. It was a one-man job that Andy did. We recruited a student in the LMU film school or aspiring actor to act. And then we got some students to do some filming, basically, without pay. We bought them lunch, I think. And then the next study we had a little bit more money. We were able to hire an actor, but it was still Andy as a one-man job. So where the one you just saw, which is our most professional one, this was a much larger NIH grant that we got. So Andy was able to actually have a crew, and I think Brave, it looks great, amazing. But I also look back at that first one we did, and it similarly looks amazing. And I think a lot of it really does have to do with, the team that you have and the script and all the the things you outlined. You don't need a massively huge budget to do, a Eugene type video. It can just be something, a talking head in one area. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about some ideas about costs or what you've done, in working with us.
Yeah, happy to. So like Eric was saying, it's a very flexible process that, part of, so Good Pictures as a company is just myself in terms of full-time employees. I have no coworkers or employees that are hired full-time. I do that intentionally to keep overhead low for clients who come to me and they say, we want a Eugene PSA for the state of California. Then we can bring 30 people into the mix to produce that, and create something that's really dynamic and polished and hopefully fun and a little funny. But then on the flip side of things, Eric mentioned the first two projects that he and I worked on together were one-man bands. I schlepped my camera around and I set up a couple lights and a boom pole and a little bit of grip equipment. And we sat there and we did the best we could with what we had. So I obviously never want cost to be the barrier to someone who has an important message actually engaging with communicating that message effectively. So I'm always happy to work with people on, the size of their budget and their exact needs. I'm also very happy to offer shortcut ideas that will not necessarily sacrifice production value, so the overall polish and style of the video or the content of the video, but will ultimately save money in the long run. There are many, many ways to approach this process. It's a very complex process. And the earlier that you can engage, if you are interested in, producing, professional, polished, engaging videos, the earlier in the process you can engage with a video producer or a production agency, the better. Because if you have a fully baked idea of, let's say, for example, 60 minutes of animation that you want to produce, and you have a $5,000 budget, I will be able to tell you in about 30 seconds that unfortunately we won't be able to animate 60 minutes worth of animation for $5,000. That simply won't be possible. But I can offer other ideas for what might be possible. So the earlier a video producer can be looped into the development and the pre-production process. So that's kind of finding the idea and then starting to kind of carve out a path forward for ultimately shooting it or producing it. You're just going to be better off if you can have an effective creative partner who's been there, done that early in the process, so they can kind of help guide you through.
That's great. Thank you. And I think you can really serve as a model for some of these partnerships between researchers and filmmakers, as we've seen that you can work within a budget. And like I mentioned, the main ideas you present really do cut across budgets. I mean, you could do everything you said, on an iPhone by yourself, as long as you have like a solid script and a message. And I think that working backwards is really an important piece. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask, let me just make sure there's no other. Let's see. I also wanted to ask about, so, for you, coming to you, you kind of served as a general contractor, mm-hmm. for our work, like you had all the connections and everything. So maybe talk a little bit about that process and how, if you did want to do something, how do you get a script writer? How do you get animators? How do you get the filmmakers, the web designer, all that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be challenging if you don't have a lot of ties to the creative world to find all of the different people to fulfill the different jobs that you might need them to fulfill. But if you find someone who is, let's say, a video producer, usually a producer is a good role. Producer, sometimes a director, or a production agency or production company, or even a creative agency, though creative agencies tend to work more on the art director side, the design, illustration side of things, less video production sometimes, but it depends. The easiest way for you to find the full team that you need is to go to a point person like a video producer who can then hire the subcontractors needed to bring a project to life. So using Office Intelligence as an example, we had to hire a director of photography, a first assistant camera who doubled as a B camera operator, so A camera and B camera. We had a production assistant, and we had a producer director, myself. So we only had 4 people. We had the on-camera talent, The production assistant helped with the teleprompter. So we only needed 4 people for the production itself. And then for post-production, I found an illustration animation team that was doing really, really high quality work at an affordable day rate. And so I reached out to them, we negotiated a deal, and then they worked as subcontractors in the post-production side of things. So to make y'all's lives easy, just find one person or one agency that you trust, whose work you admire, and would like to utilize. And then if you go to them, then they can involve all the other necessary people. Now, Eric, I did see Leah had a question for you.
Yes, I saw that too. Thanks, Leah. So, in sharing in our experience, I think what Andy said about, planning for this from the beginning, so we do intervention work, and we design mobile-based or internet-based interventions for substance use, young adults and veterans experiencing high levels of substance use. And so, in our minds, it's, hey, we're going to develop this really cool thing that's going to be engaging. Here's $5,000 in the NIH budget. I think it's that we learned that kind of the hard way, that these things do take a little bit of money. You can do it, with volunteers if necessary, but it's just at the timing of writing the budget and drafting the content, knowing we want this intervention to work. We want this thing to be viewed by people. We want it to help change people. It might be sustainable in the future. Let's talk with Andy. Let's talk with somebody like Andy that could give us, some realistic expectations, so that we know that ahead of time when we're developing. So I think it's definitely doable. I should say, for those people that know, the one where we hired the actor and Andy filmed it completely by himself, was an R34 from NIH, which is not a ton of money. The one we have currently right now is an R01, and a lot of our money went to the web developer, actually. So it's definitely doable, and it's definitely something to just think about ahead of time. Reduce yourself a couple percentage points, or reduce incentives or something to make sure you have a quality product.
And if I can quickly, I know it's 1:00 and everybody has to go, but also ask a video producer for help with an approximate amount, an estimated budget range to build into grants that you're applying for, because that'll be, kind of the easiest, most frictionless way to make sure that, the grant that you get will ultimately be able to include, let's say, video production as a line item in an accurate way, so that you can kind of produce what you're saying that you're going to produce when applying for the grant.
Exactly. Cool. All right. Thank you so much, Andy. This was great. So I think Karen's going to post an evaluation. If people have the time, into the chat, click on the evaluation, just give us a little bit of feedback and give Andy a little bit of feedback. Thanks to everybody for coming, especially thanks to Andy for coming. This was great. Again, this will be up on our website. You can view it any other time. And we will see you all next month.
Appreciate it. Have a good one, everybody.